the health and safety of our service members are at risk. From Agent Orange in Vietnam to burn pits in Iraq, the military has a history of exposing soldiers to harmful chemicals, often with devastating long-term consequences. Today, a new generation of soldiers faces a similar threat: hexavalent chromium, Cr6. This toxic carcinogen is used in primers and paints to prevent corrosion on military weapons systems and components, applied both in manufacturing and by maintainers in the field. Despite modern safety regulations, Army Aviation's response to this hazardous substance remains dangerously inadequate. If history has taught us anything, it is that we cannot afford to wait until soldiers fall ill before taking action. The failure to fully mitigate hexavalent chromium exposure in Army aviation is not due to a lack of effort, but rather a result of bureaucratic gaps and fragmented responsibilities. While there have been positive steps, such as replacing chromate primers with hex-chrome-free alternatives and introducing industrial ventilation enclosures within combat aviation brigades, CABs, these efforts remain isolated and inconsistent across the force. Leadership turnover exacerbates the problem, as new commanders inherit these issues without fully grasping their scope. As a result, lower-level leaders have limited resources to tackle the problem, and higher-level leaders remain unaware of the persistent gaps. This fragmented approach leaves many soldiers vulnerable to year-after-year exposure. The Army is also failing to comply with OSHA Standard 1910.1026-D2, which requires assessments of exposure levels for soldiers who may be exposed to chromium-6 at or above the action level. This non-compliance has significant second and third-order effects, resulting in failures to meet the requirements for exposure notification and medical surveillance. Without accurate exposure assessments, the Army cannot notify soldiers of their exposure results within the time frame mandated by OSHA, nor can it implement the necessary medical surveillance programs. This issue is further compounded by the bureaucratic practice of labeling facilities as RAC1, high risk, rather than conducting actual surveys. As a result, critical employee notifications and medical surveillance efforts are hindered, preventing the Army from taking specific, data-driven actions to protect soldier health and safety. Risk to family members. The dangers of hexavalent chromium exposure extend beyond the workplace. Inadequate or non-existent decontamination procedures mean that soldiers who are exposed to hex-chrome during tasks such as primer application or sanding may inadvertently bring toxic particles home on their clothing, skin, or personal items. This poses a significant risk to family members, particularly young children, who are more susceptible to the harmful effects of heavy metals. Secondary exposure can lead to similar health issues as direct exposure, including respiratory problems, skin irritation, and an increased risk of cancer. Lack of proper equipment. A glaring disparity in hexavalent chromium mitigation efforts is the fact that only CUMPO 1 units were mandated to purchase industrial ventilation enclosures like doorware systems, while CUMPO 2 and 3 units have been largely left behind. After 4 years, CUMPO 2 and 3 units remain with almost zero enclosures purchased, leaving soldiers in these units significantly more vulnerable to hex-chrome exposure. This lack of uniformity in implementing protective measures has created a two-tiered system of safety, where soldiers in different units are not receiving the same level of protection, despite facing identical risks. The Army's failure to enforce this mandate across all CUMPOs highlights a troubling oversight in ensuring the health and safety of all soldiers, regardless of their unit's designation. In addition, technical manuals inadequately address hex-chrome mitigation. While the Army's acquisition executive mandated updates to include appropriate warnings in 2022, no aircraft manuals have yet incorporated these changes. There is also no standardized personal protective equipment, PPE, for Army aviation to protect against HC exposure, and guidance following failed industrial hygiene, IH, surveys remains vague. Training on hex-chrome mitigation is largely absent from key Army institutions, including Advanced Individual Training, AIT, the Non-Commissioned Officer Education System, and COES, Warrant Officer Professional Military Education, WOPME, and the Aviation Captain's Career Course, ACCC. While 15G personnel, aircraft structural repairers, face the highest risk of exposure, leaders across the board are not sufficiently informed about the dangers and mitigation measures related to HC. Until equipment and procedures are properly fielded, training remains superficial at best. Weapon systems. Despite progress in reducing hex chrome use, many military equipment and components still pose HC hazards. An Army's acquisition memo from March 2022 requires program managers, PMs, to update technical manuals to include hazard information and PP requirements, but there is still no systematic plan for identifying hex chrome-free parts or components. This lack of planning perpetuates exposure risks for maintainers. Risk mitigation. Addressing hexavalent chromium exposure requires significant personnel, time, and financial resources. One potential solution is for Army Aviation to centralize high-risk tasks within aviation support companies, ASC, removing these responsibilities from aviation maintenance companies, AMC. By concentrating these hazardous activities in one location at each installation, the Army could enforce more stringent safety measures and oversight. While this shift could create logistical challenges, such as transporting parts for repair, the health and safety of soldiers must take priority. Centralized operations would ensure consistent safeguards and address the fragmented approach that has allowed hex chrome exposure to persist unchecked. Conclusion. The current response to hexavalent chromium exposure in Army aviation is inadequate and poses significant risks to the health of service members and their families. This failure stems not from a lack of effort, but from bureaucratic shortfalls and fragmented areas of coverage, which result in inconsistent and isolated initiatives. Without proper equipment, technical guidance, and training, soldiers remain at risk. Army aviation must adopt a more centralized approach to high-risk tasks, ensuring that safeguards are properly implemented and consistently enforced. While this will require significant resources and logistical adjustments, the health and safety of our soldiers must always come first. We must learn from the past and take proactive steps now to protect those who protect us.